Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. Radical Candor began as a company with a mission to rid the world of bad bosses. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about how to avoid working for a bad boss. As we talked about in our last episode on the Great Resignation, millions of people are resigning in record numbers, many because they're working for a bad boss. In this environment, companies are as desperate to hire as you are to get a job. At the same time, we recognize both from the data and folks we know that many people are still unemployed or underemployed and looking for work. So if you're one of the lucky people who actually have multiple offers, or you're in a position where you can afford to wait for the right opportunity, you don't have to pay the asshole tax. Kim's been...
Yay!
That was Kim Scott. Kim's been getting a lot... Kim, I'm going to say it, you don't have to pay the asshole tax.
Yay!
Kim's been getting a lot of questions from people about how to choose a new job, and she's noted that one of the most important things you can do is to choose your boss wisely. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. According to a Harvard Business Review article by Sarah Siebitz, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, one of the first steps to avoiding a bad boss is knowing what you're looking for, maybe in a good boss. So think about things like, how much autonomy do you want in the job? Do you want a boss who's going to be a mentor? Is this someone you actually could imagine going to with problems? We could almost think about this like a boss description. So what do you think, Kim?
One of the things that I would like to say for all of the people out there who are having, who don't have multiple offers, who really need that job right away, I just want to hold that space for a moment and say one of the things that I really hope is that eventually we will have a kind of universal income that will make the world such that nobody has to pay the asshole tax. I think that would really be the biggest shift in power that we could have.
Here.
But anyway, so if you are looking at a new job and you know who your boss will be in that new job, I would say I love the idea of a boss description. And the first thing I would say is the first thing on that description should just be trust your gut. Your instincts are telling you is so much more important than any list of criteria that I could give you or that anyone else could give you. So what I say to people when they're hiring and also when they're taking a job, if you're not dying to work for this person, don't take the job. If you're not sure what you think of this person, you can start by making kind of a list of pros and cons. What do you like about the person? And be really try to pull the flags on the field out into your consciousness. Often these lurk in our subconsciousness. And keep wrestling with that list of pros and cons until you come to what is called the determinative factor. There's one thing that matters more than anything else. And what is that for you? I can tell you what it is for me, but it may be something different for you. But for me, it's usually been, can this person help me take a step in the direction of my dreams, or are they just going to trip me up?
Kim, I'm really curious, you talk about where you are in a career. Are you on a steep growth trajectory or not? And I'm wondering, do you think that, can this person help me take a step in the direction of my dreams, or will they trip me up? Is that something you feel like you've had throughout your career, or has that changed depending on where you are personally?
What I want certainly has changed, and my dreams have sort of changed over time. Although I've always kind of wanted the same thing. I've always wanted to build my career as a writer without being a starving writer. And so, at different points in my career, what that step was different, but the dream was pretty consistent. But I think that's unusual. A wise person once told me that only about 3% of us really know what they want to do when they grow up, and they confuse the hell out of the rest of us. So if you don't have one dream, maybe you have 3 or 4 different dreams. But is this person gonna help you move towards what you want in life, or are they going to get in your way? And to me, that was important. But for different people, the determinative factor is very different.
Yeah, I'm really curious. Jason, where does that land for you? Do you feel like you can point to one determinative factor if you were going to go out there and get a new boss?
I think there's two things that are closely related in my mind. So it might not be a single determinative factor, or maybe they are one thing. But the first thing is that the person is genuinely interested in me and my perspective. I feel like I can tell when someone is trying to solve their problem and sees me as a solution versus like actually sees me as a human being and is interested in what I think and what I might do. And the second one is like a demonstrated willingness to like leave me the hell alone. I feel like I've definitely walked.
So you walk into interviews that just say, leave me the hell alone, and see how that lands.
Well, I'm saying it in a cheeky way, but really what it boils down to is like, I am happiest when I can, we joke, we call my sort of like theoretical title at Radical Candor is Chief Tinkerer. And I feel like I do my best work when I can kind of try things without someone sort of helicoptering in and saying, oh, actually, maybe do this or do that. I'm really good about asking for help. Like, I don't have a problem reaching out and saying like, hey, I'm stuck or I'm not sure what to do here. Do you have any ideas? But I can tell the difference between a boss in an interview. I've been able to tell the difference many times between a boss who's like actually interested in what I think and what I might do and is willing to give me some space to actually try those things versus someone who has a very clear picture of what they want. And they're trying to see if I fit their mold. I know that I'm not going to excel in those environments. Like, I don't do well under a microscope. That's not my happy place. I do much better when I have a high degree of autonomy. I think in order for that to work in the long term, that's why that sort of trust in my ideas and thinking needs to be there, right? Because you can give someone autonomy for a very short period of time and not really care about their ideas, but that's going to wear off real quick if you don't, if you actually just want them to do what you want them to do.
And it's really interesting when I hear both for you, Jason and Kim, the boss description in many ways is really around self-awareness, knowing where you are, knowing what you want, knowing what your tendencies are. Jason, we've joked about, the idea of being a micromanager or an absentee manager, and you really do not want a micromanager. Obviously, we want a thought partner, but knowing yourself well enough to know what helps you thrive. So beyond this kind of self-awareness boss description, Kim, what else are we looking for?
I want to ask you a question, Amy, because I'm curious. If you had to, when I talk about the determinative factor, what I'm really talking about is taking the time, respecting your gut enough to inquire into what it is, the signals it's sending you. Like, what would be your determinative factor for a boss?
It's a great question. And I think it really goes for me for that definition that we ask folks in our workshops a lot. What does care personally look like for you? And for me, when I think about, when I give the specific example of some of the things that Jason does, and there's this idea of they have the time, and I think it goes to what Jason is saying about the interest. Now, for me, the way the interest shows up is actually different than Jason. I want Jason's time. I want him to be able to bounce ideas off with me. And so I really appreciate it because it's clearly not, if he's left to his own druthers, he'd rather be left to his own druthers. But he's actually there to be a sounding board for me to help co-create something. So for me, having that collaborative thought partner is really important. And that's, to me, how they show they care.
I'm so glad you said that, because I realized that a bunch of the stuff I'm about to say sort of attends maybe a little bit more to challenge directly.
I'm just here to bring some care personally into this conversation.
Thanks for the love, Amy. We needed a little dose of love. When I was writing the book, actually, my editor, Tim Bartlett, would write in the margins often, hello, care personally. So keep me honest on that. I really do care. I don't know why. I guess I want to be challenged. I assume everybody loves me, so I just want to be challenged.
What would it be like to go through the world? Everybody loves me.
It's like one of my favorite stories about battle. My son, he was chasing chickens in a yard, and he caught one. And he was holding it tight. He was hugging this chicken, and the chicken was terrified. It was pooping all over him. And he looks at me very proudly and he says, "This chicken loves me." So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Or the poop from the chicken, but please go on.
Anyway, so I think that the core thing that all three of us are saying is that you want a boss who's going to be respectful of you in particular and of everyone on the team. Because even if this boss respects you, if they're disrespectful of other people on the team, that is going to leave you in an uncomfortable situation. So you want a boss who is respectful.
And Kim, can I just add to that? Because one of the things I think that you might find really interesting as some data is when we talk about what makes praise difficult, we've had folks say, I don't want praise because my peers are getting pissed off that I'm always the one that's being praised. And so that idea of equity and inclusion across the board, I think is really important to bring in.
Yeah. And sometimes bosses do use praise as, why can't the rest of you all be like Amy? And that puts Amy in an awkward situation, right?
I'm going to add that it's sort of interesting in a distributed world, it's like harder to see incidental interactions. But I remember when I used to do interviews in person, we would make sure that everyone flip the situations, like evaluating candidates. We would have everyone who interacted with the candidate write an evaluation, including the person who greeted them at the door, because we were looking for those moments of like, does the facade slip when you think you're not talking to someone who is important? And it was really interesting. We did not hire people. There were several people who did really well in their technical interviews, and we rejected them because they were rude to our office manager. And I think part of what you're saying, Kim, is like we're looking for those moments, right? We're trying to see into those other interactions. So I like this idea of looking beyond sort of ourselves and inquiring about how this person interacts with others.
Yeah. I mean, I think the giant red flag is when there's someone who views their job as a manager as sort of a value judgment, and they feel a sense of superiority over the people who work for them. That's not going to result in respect, and it's going to result in a miserable situation. So there's a few questions, maybe like the question, how can we suss that out? So what are some questions we can ask? One is like, what is your management philosophy? Jason, if I were to ask you, if I'm going to come to work for you and I asked you, what's your management philosophy? What would you say, and what would be some red flags?
I would say that my management philosophy revolves around two things. As the CEO of Radical Candor, I see it as my job to sort of de-risk the success of our organization. And what I mean by that specifically is like, my job is sort of like try to see the future, see around corners, and to try to build a team and an organization that can help us get to where we're trying to go. And as a result, my management philosophy is really all about growth, right? Like I'm trying to think about how do we as an organization grow into that potential that we see for the future of Radical Candor. That influences everything that I do, both as a sort of an operator as well as a manager. And so in a supportive way, I'm going to push people to help us grow toward that future. And that, in my mind, is directly linked to that person's individual growth. I think I am the best manager to people who are excited about learning and growing and changing. I'm probably not the best manager for people who are like very happy where they are. Like, not because I can't manage people like that, but I'm probably, my sort of mind and skills are attuned better to people who are sort of excited about growing and learning. And I definitely saw that in my past.
Jason, if somebody came to you and you said that as your philosophy about growth, do you feel like it's your responsibility as the hiring manager to say, so if you're not interested in growth, it's not a good fit? Like, how much is the responsibility on the hiring manager to suss that out just as much as the other person is sussing it out?
I was going to say, like, it's not that I can't work with somebody who doesn't want to grow. Although I was going to say that it's very rare, that I have very rarely met someone who's a person who's actually disinterested in growing. I also feel like there's a Radical Candor as an organization. We have this sort of value on growth mindset. So I feel like there is and it's not just about me and my management style. It's something that we broadly as an organization value. And so I would struggle to manage someone effectively who had a very fixed mindset. That would be very challenging. So I do think that there's a potential fit problem there. That said, I think there's lots of ways to grow. And so like if someone came in and said, I'm not looking for a promotion at Radical Candor, but what I am looking for is to become a better writer, for example. I would say, okay, well, that's really interesting. There's lots of opportunities at Radical Candor to write things. There's probably a way that we can work that into your responsibilities and make sure that you're getting the opportunity to learn more and grow.
I love that answer, Jason. I also want to say, like, in my experience of you anyway, is that you're not hell-bent on growing too fast. I mean, one of the things that you and I talked about early is that we didn't want to raise venture capital because we wanted to grow at the right pace. We didn't want to grow too fast.
Yeah, I guess in Silicon Valley that can have there can be there's like an association with the word growth that is like hyper growth.
Yeah. Cancerous growth, and we want to grow healthily, not cancerously.
Yes, that's a great point, Kim. Thank you.
For folks listening, when you ask whoever your new boss is what their management philosophy is, I also want you to cut this person some slack, because Jason and I and Amy and I think all the time about what bosses do, what are the actual roles. Like in Radical Candor, I say bosses get feedback from and give feedback to teams in order to achieve results. It took me months of thinking to come up with it. It sounds so simple, but it's actually, really hard. You don't want to be super judgmental of this person, but you want them to have some idea of what their responsibilities as a boss are. You want them to be the kind of manager who wants to do the things that managers do. They don't want to be the boss. So I think that's kind of what you're looking for. I'd also suggest that you dig into the details. If somebody says something that sounds buzzwordy, or you're just not sure what they mean, ask them for a specific example. Ask them to tell a story. So if someone says to you, my job is to create a psychologically safe environment, that's awesome. But ask them what they're actually doing to create that psychologically. Maybe they think that's their job, but they have no idea how to do it. So you want to, in the same way that this prospective boss has dug into the details with you, you want to feel free to dig into the details with them. Probably after you get the offer, not before.
Kim, how would it land for you if you were in a hiring conversation and someone asked you to describe a few employees that you've worked really well with and some others who you've worked poorly with? How would that question land for you, or how have you seen that play out?
Obviously, it's a challenging question, and so I would feel slightly nervous, but in a good way, like you want people who are going to challenge you. So I would say that I work really well with people who will tell me when I'm making a mistake and who are willing to take a risk. Although, as the boss, it's my job to create an environment where you're not taking a huge risk to tell me what you think, but who are willing, sometimes, like all of us, especially if I'm hungry or tired or whatever, I'm not a good listener. So people who are willing to take an extra step to sort of bust through my whatever it is that I'm focused on and say, look, stop, Kim, this doesn't make any sense. It's true that everyone has some people who have hated working with them. And so I think the people who have hated working with me are the people who want a super organized and unchaotic boss. I think that I really have bothered those people tremendously. And
is this the story of the sweatshirt or the T-shirt? Are we coming back to that?
No, there's another story I've never even told because it's so painful. The story of the T-shirt, for those of you who missed it, was we I would change everything in my life every 5 minutes if I could. And for some people, this is really distressing. And so there was a person who was leading marketing at a startup where I was working, and I kept changing the tagline of the company. And at one point, I woke up at 3 a.m. and I had a much better idea for our tagline. And I went in with great excitement to tell the head of marketing about this. And she burst into tears and said, but I already ordered the T-shirts. I really had to pause and think, okay, I'm not going to mock. I mean, I'm doing it even now. Like, I'm not going to mock that emotion. That emotion is telling me something and I need to listen to it.
Yes, and as the person who's probably been the one that ordered the T-shirts. I can empathize.
And in fact, I still have that. This was 30 years ago, and I still have those T-shirts with the old tagline on them as a lesson. And in fact, one ripped recently, and I had it sewn up, which seemed ridiculous, but I need to keep this T-shirt. It's important to me.
I'm curious, as I hear that story, Jason, what's on your mind about, like, how radically candid do we actually want to get in these hiring manager conversations?
I know it feels very much like a dance when we're having these conversations, but to some extent, if you're like most people, you're probably going to wind up staying in this job for at least a year. very few people are going to quit in the first year. It takes, I think, a lot of courage and self-confidence to realize you've made a mistake and quit in less than a year. And plus, there's sort of like
stigma. But I recommend doing that. I think quitting fast is really, if you quit in the first month, then people think it's the company's fault, not your fault. Just some unsolicited advice for those of you out there who just took a job and hate it. Quit!
Yeah, that's right. But that's why I'm like, I kind of feel like front loading these conversations, like having an awkward disagreement with your hiring manager before you start the job and realizing like, wow, we really don't see eye to eye on some things is better in my mind than spending a year someplace. And I would agree with Kim that if you can figure out that if it is clear what's wrong and you can figure that out and act on it, the quicker the better for you and for the organization. I think there's a lot of people who stay in positions that aren't a great fit for them or with managers who aren't a great fit for them. More than that, I would say that part of a boss's job is to be willing to hear differing perspectives. Part of a good boss is going to be willing to hear something that they may not like. And so I don't think it's unreasonable, since there's so much emphasis, especially in the world of tech, on getting to like skills-based interviewing, to have the same kind of like back and forth with your boss, to expect the same thing of them in return. And I think if this stuff matters to you and you care about it, like the right organization, the right boss is not going to respond super negatively to it. So I think there may be, to Kim's point, like a moment of sort of like nervousness or being taken aback. But I think most bosses who are actually interested in doing the right thing, broadly speaking, will be willing to engage in a disagreement.
Some specific ideas that I've offered people is questions you can ask to see how your boss is going to respond to feedback. Is ask your boss about a failure. Your prospective boss probably asked you about a failure, but turn around is fair play. Ask them, and ask them who told them they were failing. If your prospective boss says it was an employee like that and they responded well, that's a great sign. I mean, you may not get that answer, but that's an ideal answer. Snow melts at the periphery. Your employees know when failure is going to happen long before the boss does, usually. Bosses who are willing to hear from employees, hey, the snow's melting out here, do better than those who don't want to know. So I think you want a boss who is open to feedback from employees and who is willing to tell you about a time when an employee gave them some feedback that was useful to them. And if they've never had that experience, that means they're not listening to the feedback from their employees, I would argue.
I think it's a great example. And what's on my mind is a question we often get, especially from folks who are individual contributors or maybe a little lower down in the hierarchy, which is, how do I give my boss feedback? And so I'm curious, in that interview itself, Jason, what's your perspective on giving this prospective boss some feedback about something you observed in the interview?
We solicited feedback. We just hired somebody new to the team. We're so excited to have her aboard. She started yesterday. Tanya, welcome.
Welcome.
Your first
Welcome,
podcast
Tanya.
shout out.
Yay.
We solicited feedback about the interview process. A lot of organizations don't do that, but my experience is that I've received a fair amount of unsolicited feedback about interview processes from potential candidates. And so I don't think it's unusual, right? And so if I was going to do it, I might say, hey, I wanted to share something that I've observed as part of this process. Would it be like, could I share that with you? Just to like see what it'd be like to give you some feedback, right? Set it up as an experiment. We're actually going to try to do this. And I don't think you're giving too much away by doing that, because it's really hard for people to hide their real emotional reactions to those things, especially if you could see and hear them clearly through some sort of video medium or something like that. But like, that's the way that I would approach it. I would treat it as like, let's just have an experiment. I'll share an observation that I had from my interview experience, and I'd love to get your reaction to it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I mean, people call me and say, I'm thinking of taking a job with this person. What should I do? I say, get into an argument with this person about something. Have a disagreement and see how it goes. Could be that you're very happy with your compensation package, but you're not happy with your medical benefits or something. Talk about it. Like, don't wait until after you start the job. See what it's like to have that conversation. Here's how you want it to go. Scott O'Neill told me, who works in sports management, told me a great story about interviewing a woman for a job. He was managing a basketball team, and he had this couch in his office that was sort of designed for 7 feet tall men or people, I guess they happen to be all men. And he was interviewing a woman, and And he asked her, I mean, he solicited it, so that's already a good sign. But he said, was there anything in the interview process that made you uncomfortable? And she was sitting on this couch, and if she had sat back, it would have been like Thumbelina, her legs straight. I'm 5 feet tall, so this happens to me all the time. There are very few couches I can actually sit on. She said, do you notice anything about how I'm sitting? And he didn't. And then she pulled herself back. And so he put some pillows on his couch. That's a sign of someone who's going to listen to the feedback and actually take action. The next time she came in, there were pillows on the couch. And that's what you want to see.
That's awesome. It's really interesting as we think about the Radical Candor order of operations. And so you've done your self-awareness, your self-assessment, what you're looking for. You've solicited feedback. Now let's talk about praise.
Yes. You want a boss who gives praise.
And how can you figure that out in an interview?
What do you think, Jason?
Again, there's an interesting tension in the overall process, which is one thing you want your company to do is you want your company to have a rigorous enough process that they've helped to mitigate or manage bias. And one of the things that you do in order to do that is you try to encourage people not to come to conclusions about someone simply because you're getting along with them in the interview, right? You actually want to think about what they said, how they plan to react to certain things. And so I'm putting myself in the position of the boss for the moment and saying, I would feel a tension in the moment of the interview if someone was like, what's something that went really well in the interview? Or what do you think I'm a great fit for this role? And I've been asked that question several times. And what I would say is part of my job is to really think about that. And I don't want to make a snap judgment in the moment. That doesn't mean you're not a good fit. It just means that my job is to really think about our overall conversation and to come up with an assessment of what I think your fitness is for the job after doing that. And I can't do that well in the moment. So I don't want to make that mistake. And so the way that I would approach it, if I was on the other side of the table, is I would ask them, what is something that you have seen go really well recently on your team that you brought to everybody's attention? They should have an answer to that. If they're regularly praising people, it should not take them a really long time to think of something that went really well that they brought to the attention of their team. Another way to ask that might be what's something that you called out in a staff meeting, a recent sort of staff or all hands meeting as a really big success for the organization? And I would guess that that's going to be a stumper for a lot of people. Most people will not be able to immediately answer that question, which is just sort of interesting data.
Another way to ask a question is when someone on your team does something amazing, or even if they just do a good job on something, how do you let them know? Some people will say to you, it's not my job to tell people when they're just doing their job. And that's a giant red flag about that person. And it doesn't mean that person is a horrible individual. I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable giving praise, in part, Amy, for the reason you mentioned, that sometimes you're accidentally throwing someone under the bus and making their peers envious of them. And you don't want that kind of praise. But you also, often it feels patronizing. I think if the person says, it feels kind of patronizing, that doesn't mean they're going to be a terrible boss. I mean, that's just true. And so the question is, have you ever had a boss who gives praise in a way that's not patronizing? Ask a follow-up question. It doesn't mean, don't just reject them out of hand because they don't know. Because
they might not have taken a Radical Candor workshop yet.
Yeah.
But I say that jokingly, but it's true. We really have found the importance of teaching specific and sincere praise, following that context, observation, result, next steps model, same exact model, praise and criticism. And I was really touched in a workshop recently where we had 2 sessions. The first session, we introduced the idea of praise. Then we encouraged folks to practice praise. And at the end of the first session, after they practiced some praise, they said, there are all these moments where people are doing things and we're not noticing those little wins along the way. And that's really how we build the sort of relationship deposits in the bank. And having that practice time, they come back a week or 2 later and they realize, gosh, there's so much good stuff happening here. And now I can finally notice it and acknowledge it. And I think especially when people are feeling not as motivated, when people give specific and sincere praise for their work product or their behavior, it can really build relationships.
Absolutely. Of course, it can't all be sweetness and light. You also want a boss who's going to give criticism.
Thanks, Kim. I can really count on you. Let's get into the criticism.
So, Jason, what do you think? What's a good way to find out if a boss is good at criticism?
I think the question, what's an example of a really difficult piece of criticism that you had to give to an employee, is a good way to get into it. When I ask a question like this, I always to ask like a follow-up is like, is this recent? Is this in the distant past? Like, they may not give you all of the information, but I think asking that kind of question is helpful. I also think asking the question, what's an example of a time you gave a piece of criticism quickly that helped to sort of avert a crisis or a long, slow train wreck? Because it's helpful to know what kind of small things people notice that they correct quickly, as well as to notice the big things that they correct when they've gone terribly wrong.
This goes back to your aversion for coffee. If you recall, this is because Jason only got asked for coffee when there was criticism, and then would only find out about the really big things on these coffee walks.
Coffee.
Yes.
That's why you don't have coffee anymore.
I've regained my taste for coffee, thankfully, but literally there was like a decade of my life where I was like, coffee's gross, and I couldn't figure out why. I realized that I'd been traumatized by my boss.
It's interesting because I was that boss once. When I was at Juice, whenever I had to have a hard conversation with someone, I'd say, you want to go across the street to Dean and DeLuca for a cappuccino. And I learned later it was called the Cappuccino of Doom. So anyway, look for those.
You must have both read the same management book. Where you
take them for a cup of coffee and then tell them how terribly they're doing.
That was the school of hard knocks. As you're talking, Jason and Amy, also, it made me think, you can combine two questions. Like, what's a time that you failed to give someone feedback and had a bad result? Like, if you can elicit that Bob story, my favorite story in Radical Candor is the story of poor Bob, who I failed to give feedback to. And if that manager, if your prospective boss shows a lot of self-awareness that they learned from that experience and that's the thing that motivates them to give criticism in a way that is kind, that shows they care personally as well as clear, then you've got potentially a good boss.
Yep.
Now, Kim, we talk about, now that we're brushing and flossing apparently in this interview because we're practicing good radical candor hygiene. We talk a lot about gauging. And so this idea of, adjusting based on how the person is responding. So you said that you actually want to have some sort of disagreement with the person in the room. So how would you gauge, either based on asking them a question or actually observing how they're responding to you? How would you practice gauging in that moment?
I'm often unintentionally rude to people. So if I made that mistake, it would be interesting to me to see. I'm not advocating. I just want to make this totally clear. Do not go in and be intentionally rude. This is not a good idea because you want to show that you care personally.
We are not recommending rudeness, just to be clear.
No, we are not. We are not. But if you find that you've said something that accidentally pissed that person off, how do they respond when they're angry? Is really interesting to just notice. So some people, when they're angry, they shut down and then they come back to you. That's fine. They get back to the conversation when they're not angry. Can they manage their own emotions is kind of what you're looking for. I will say one time I had a colleague of mine, a friend of mine from business school, asked me if I would help him find a CEO job. There was a COO job I knew about, and I asked him if he was interested in that. And he said, no, I'm only interested in CEO jobs. And I said, why? And he said, because when I'm the CEO, then people have to deal with my neuroses. I don't have to. And I refused to help him find, you want people who are managing their own neuro. We all have them. You want people who take accountability and responsibility for their own emotions, which are, it's okay if a person gets mad. The question is, how do they respond when they get mad? Other than having a disagreement with a person, you could also ask the prospective boss, have you ever given anyone some feedback and then they started yelling at you? What did you do? Sometimes these interviews can be like poetry, emotion recollected in tranquility. And that's maybe a less stressful way. Like, see if they can tell you a story about a time when someone either yelled at them or someone brushed off their feedback. Ask them what they did.
I love that, emotion recollected in tranquility. Did I get that right?
Poetry and an interview.
Poetry.
It's all so calm.
It's so calm. We're heading into the end of the year. We're so calm. We're so relaxed. Jason, What do you do when somebody brushes off your feedback? I'm now interviewing you. I'm going to work for you, and I'm just really curious. I've got some feedback for you. What have you done if somebody ignores your feedback or they don't want to hear it?
I think if context matters here. If this is the first time that I'm having a conversation with this person and they're saying, oh, I don't actually think it's a big deal, I might say something like, well, I think it matters. And what I want to encourage you to do is between now and our next one-on-one, I want you to pay attention to this. I want you to see if you notice this thing happening, assuming it's not egregious and it's not something I have to correct immediately before the person leaves the office, or it's going to cause major harm to somebody else or the organization. I want you to pay attention to this, and I want to come back and I want to try to have another conversation about it and see if you might see things a little bit differently. But if I have had this conversation multiple times, the person's sort of continuing to brush me off, I might take a different approach. So there's a couple of things that I've tried in the past. One of them is saying something like, hey, I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like we've had this conversation, 5 times now, and it doesn't feel like we're getting very far. I've tried to be really clear that I think this is important. It's something that needs to change. You've made it fairly clear to me that you don't think it's important and it's something that needs to change. What do you think we should do?
And that would work for you, Jason. I like that.
You're hired.
I've had the good fortune of working with incredibly capable, thoughtful people. And so usually when I'm butting up against this, it's not because the person is somehow a bad person. It's we really see the world in a different way. And I'm trying to figure out, is there a way out of this? Do I need to change something? Do they need to change something? That's what I'm looking for, is the willingness to engage. And I will say, a lack of willingness to engage, even after overtures, is a red flag for me as a manager. So if someone is continuously ignoring the feedback, my feedback and the feedback of others, that would be a major red flag that I would want to follow up on very seriously.
And the question, we all occasionally brush off feedback. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story about why are we saying brush off feedback? I have a story about that. I used to say blow off feedback.
We've taken a terrible turn.
And I was giving a Radical Candor talk to an audience that wasn't American. And someone afterwards, it was a British audience, and someone afterwards said they had heard third hand some feedback about my presentation. Did I want to hear it? And it was clear that this person was very, very, very reluctant. I really had to work hard. I had to have 3 conversations with this person before they finally said, in the UK, blowing off has a totally different meaning than you intended. This is in the post-Me Too era, and so he was understandably reluctant to say this to me, but it was important. I'm very grateful to him for telling me. But the irony was that the organization, this British organization that I was giving it to, their HR people wouldn't let them give it to me directly because they were so concerned about the Me Too stuff. So anyway, we could do a whole podcast episode just on that. But the point here is that you really want to work for someone who is going to keep soliciting the feedback. If they sense that there's something wrong, they're going to keep talking to you.
And Kim, actually, what recommendations, especially given your work with Just Work, your new book, if there's some sort of other red flags around bias, prejudice, bullying in the interview itself?
Yeah, so this is really tricky because probably if you're underrepresented along some dimension, you're at the very least going to experience some form of bias in the process. Mm-hmm. So while it is a red flag, if you refuse to work for any organization that demonstrates a little bias, it'll be very difficult for you to get a job. And I hate to say it shouldn't be that way, and I hope it will change. But the question is not whether there is any bias, but how do they respond when you tell them that you've observed some bias. So I think especially if it's bias, you want to make sure that you are able to sort of point it out, that you may want to wait until after you get the offer, but that you point out what happened. And bias I describe as not meaning it. There's a big difference between bias, prejudice, and bullying. Bias is usually an unconscious belief that when we examine it, we don't actually believe it. It's an unconscious thought, even. I shouldn't say it's a belief. Whereas prejudice is a very conscious belief. It's meaning it. And bullying is just being mean. So bias, not meaning it. Prejudice, meaning it. bullying, being mean. And so distinguishing between these is important because the best way to respond is very different. If it's bias, you want to respond with an I statement, which sort of invites that other person to understand the situation from your perspective. So I don't think you're going to take me seriously when you call me honey. And how does that, I probably wouldn't work for someone who called me honey, but I might if they responded very well. That's an example of just responding with an I statement. And in fact, in Just Work, I tell a story about not taking a job because someone said something biased. And in retrospect, if I had said, I don't think you're going to take me seriously when you refer to me as pretty girl, maybe that person would have responded well, and maybe I could have taken a job. I don't know. I didn't bother to find out. So it can be worth it to respond with an I statement. Whereas if it's prejudice, probably what they're doing is illegal or an HR violation or just ridiculous. So you want to use an it statement. It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair, or some examples of its statements. There's a lot more to be said about this. Whereas if it is bullying, if the person is just sort of using your identity against you to gain some sort of advantage in the conversation, you want a you statement. You can't talk to me like that. And this is something I learned from my daughter when she was getting bullied at school. I was encouraging her. We often confuse these things. And so I was encouraging her to use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. She banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, he is trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell him he succeeded? And I thought, that is a good point. So try thinking about what if something makes you uncomfortable and you think it may be bias, it may be prejudice, it may be bullying, try to identify what it is and respond and see how the other person responds. And that will give you a really good signal about whether they're open to change or not. So one of the things that your prospective boss, I promise you, has done is to check your backdoor references. So they've looked for someone that they know personally who knows you. That you can do for your boss too. Find someone who has worked for that boss who's willing to talk to you. You can find them on LinkedIn. You can find them a number of different places. Just start, asking people who've worked at that organization if they know someone who has worked for that prospective boss and what it was like to work with them. You can also ask for a reference of someone who worked for them. So say, can I talk to someone else who has worked for you? You can get a front door reference as well.
Yeah. I actually think it's a red flag when you don't talk, like if you don't wind up talking to any of that person's direct reports through the process of the interview, like that would be really strange. Like they might have a reason for it, but I think it's totally reasonable to expect that they would introduce you to someone and that person should be open to questions about what it's like to work with them, right? So if you started to ask like, so what's it like to work with Kim? And the person's like, well, that's not really what we're here to talk about. Like, that would be a major red flag.
Yeah. And ideally, you also might talk to someone who used to work for them, but doesn't anymore because you're more likely to get an honest answer.
Yep.
Excellent. All right. Well, to wrap things up, and as we close out the end of 2021, grateful for your time, for your care, for your challenging. Now it's time for a Radical Candor checklist, tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice. So first, think about what matters to you in a boss and pay attention. How does the hiring manager treat you throughout the interview process? Trust your gut. Is this person really going to be someone you can imagine being a thought partner with?
Tip number 2, ask the manager, the prospective manager, specific questions about how they intend to manage you. Hopefully you get really thoughtful answers, but what you're looking for is the person to really engage. Because as Kim said, not everybody thinks about these questions all day, every day. But again, the expectation should be there that they're willing to engage you on those topics and they demonstrate thoughtfulness.
And tip number 3, research your prospective manager online and find someone who has worked for them and ask them for their honest perspective about what it's like to work for this person. In an ideal world, you'll find someone who you know who used to work for that prospective boss, or a friend of a friend of a friend, or a friend of a friend. But plug your network and find someone who is going to shoot straight with you, and try to get a couple of different perspectives, because for some people, I'm a great boss. For other people, I am a disaster boss. So you want to make sure that this person is right for you.
I feel like we need to say something about that.
It's true. There are people who have worked for me who hated working for me.
But not us. I think that's what
just
Amy
like we are not talking to be clear, these people are not on this podcast.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's a great way to end the year.
Yeah, well, we could do even better. We could do,
Sandler.
Here I am. The house of care personally.
For you, with you all as well. For you
I
all.
think you are working for us, Kim. And actually, I say that jokingly, but you are doing this work in service of our growth and making the world a better place. And I am grateful to you and to your orange sweater, and now to your purple sweater as well.
Love us.
And Jason, thank you. And by the way, just to let you know, as we close this interview, you're hired. I hope that you will continue to remain my boss. Thank you.
Your manager. Yes. Okay, good. Glad to know.
I guess we've got to close for more tips. You can go to radicalcandor.com/resources to download our learning guides for practicing radical candor. And to hear the show notes for this episode, head to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Of course, we do welcome other feedback as well. And don't forget to order Kim's new book with a very new title, Just Work. Kim, do you want to say it? Just Work.
Just Work, How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusion. Available everywhere books are sold.
And finally, the Radical Candor store, now open. 'Tis the season. Go to radicalcandor.com, click the shop link to get your Radical Candor swag. I hear there's ornaments.
Yes, I have an ornament on my tree.
Fantastic.
Which I love. Makes me care personally.
I think this is the new motto. We're going to bring on the care for 2022. Bye for now.
Yes. Have a great holiday season.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.